Well, here we are back at 𝗏𝗺𝗺𝗏 Lake, and this is the final part of our day fishing series where we try and catch a carp with just a day at our disposal using a different method each time. Today's method is going to be fishing over a spod mix, so I'll be using lots of different pieces in a mix, and I'll show you how I go about putting the mix together and the end tackle that I might use to fish over it. So without further ado, let's get down to the bank and pick a swim. For most of my fishing, when I turn up at the lake, I'll be looking around, looking for signs of fish, trying to find out where they are, and tailoring my approach according to what the scenario is that I found them in. Now, this is a really intimate little lake with lots of close-in spots, lots of lily pads close in and reed beds and things like that, but that's not the sort of area that I'd want to be using a spod approach. And as I'm here today to show you how I go about putting together a spod mix and fishing over it, I've picked more of an open water swim. There are fish in the area. I've seen a couple show, and I've seen the water rocking on the far side, sort of just past 3/4 of the way over. So that's probably where I'm going to be concentrating on. Now, obviously, when I'm putting a spom out, I'll be creating a fair amount of disturbance. So it's not essential that I keep everything quiet. I'm going to be trying to create a feeding area. So it's going to be a case of put some bait out and then wait and sit on top of it and wait for the fish to find the bait, and hopefully get in a feeding mood, get the heads down, and maybe we'll catch one or two. The first thing I need to do in my session is to make up my spod mix, of which I'll put a fair old bit of it out to create a nice feeding area for fish to home in on and get comfortable feeding on. So what am I going to put in my spod mix? The world's your oyster, really. It's a great opportunity to use lots and lots of different types of feed, and it's a good way to sort of minimise the cost. Boilies aren't cheap nowadays, and so a boilie only approach in some situations, and it's probably what I do mostly, is use a boilie only approach because I don't use that much bait. But if I'm in a situation where I need to be using an awful lot of bait, then using boilies is quite an expensive way to go about it. So what you can do is use a spod mix that's got an element of boilie in it, but has got other items within the feed, like bulking ingredients. So for today, I've got a number of ingredients that I'd be happy to use in any mix that I might make up. First up, I've got my boilies. Now, rather than just put those in whole, I'll be using a mixture of various different sizes and even some crumbed up baits. I've got hemp seed. That's got to go in any spod mix, isn't it? Hemp. Carp love hemp. I've got like a seed mix, which has got all sorts of different seeds and pulses in it. It's got tares and some maize, bits and pieces in there. We've got some pellet. We've got some sort of fairly large 6mm pellet. A selection of tiny little pellets as well, and corn. Corn's one of the best additions to a spod mix. It's visual. Carp love it, and it also gives you a hook bait alternative. So whereas you could use boilie on the hook if you've got boilies in the mix, it's a nice idea to have other bite-sized pieces that can be used on the hook. Things like hemp and tiny seeds are maybe a little bit too small to present, but like a stack of corn, boilies, tiger nuts, things like that, it's really important that I've got some items within the mix that I can use as hook baits. One of the things I think is really important with a spod mix is to not use any of the ingredients in too great a proportion. It's ever so easy just to put a load of hemp in a bucket, sprinkle a can of corn in there and fish over that. But fish being pre-programmed to feed on the most abundant food source can get really preoccupied on one particular item. And if that's hemp or something that you can't present on the hook, then you can be in trouble. They can just be singling out all those tiny little grains and avoiding what you've got on the hook. So what I prefer to do is to have similar proportions of everything. So for instance, for the mix today, I'll be putting, say, 2 or 3 handfuls of whole boilies in, 2 or 3 handfuls of chops, 2 or 3 handfuls of crumb boilie, and exactly the same sort of amounts of hemp and seeds, and that much corn. So that'll probably be a can and a half of corn, and the same with the pellets, so that everything's there in a similar proportion, and the fish will find it a lot more difficult to single out one particular food item and become focused on it. The first thing that's going into a mix is a couple of handfuls of whole boilies going in. Some of them are just like squashing between my fingers. So I just want a load of random different sizes in there just to keep them guessing and get them feeding on food items that are any size from tiny little bits and pieces right up to the size of a whole boilie. Next up, I'm going to put some hemp seed in. As I said, that's going to go in a similar amount to the chops. a little mix up together. We've got some mixed particles here. A good dose of those. We've got some tares. So a mixture of small seeds and a few larger ones. Bit of maize in there as well. And again, same sort of amount. So that mix is like coming together quite nicely now. We've got quite a lot of bulk in there. Pellets. We get loads of those in there. Cheaper ingredient. I'm not weighing any of the ingredients. I'm only estimating it. I'm not saying that everything's got to be exactly the same amount, but it just wants to be roughly in equal proportions. And those pellets, they're going to start to soak up some of the liquids that are in like the hemp seed and stuff like that, and all that's going to start soaking into the pellets and get them started off breaking down. The same with some tiny pellets, some of those. And then we also want some sweet corn. We want a couple of cans of that. Will give me a similar sort of amount to what I put in. There we go. Now the liquid from the can goes in as well, because that's all going to give me some nice smell. But I'd also like to introduce a few more liquids to a spod mix. Now there's various ones that I'll use. I'll use smart liquid, which is quite thick. I think it's a good idea to use some oil as well, or I might use something called multi-stim. I probably wouldn't put all three in, but the oil definitely is going to go in, and I'll put one of the other two in. So let's get some hemp seed oil in. Not something that you can overdo. You can use a fish oil or hemp seed oil, pretty much any oil you like. I do sort of try and tailor the oil to the mix that I'm using. So if I was using fish meal boilie in there and lots of fishy pellets, then I'd err on the side of a fish meal oil. This is predominantly seed based, so I'm using hemp seed oil for this one. And we'll put some multi-stim in with that today. Another ingredient that we can't really overdo. Don't need to put loads in, but just something to give it a nice sweet profile and to get some liquid attraction leaking off the mix. We'll give that a nice mix around. And I've got one final ingredient to go in there, and it's another good bulking ingredient, but also one that gives some visual attraction to the mix, and that's a powder of some sort. Now for that you can use base mix, you can use any sort of ground bait. This is like a hemp type ground bait. Not only does it bulk the mix out, but it can create a nice cloudy area, and even if fish do come in and clear up most of the food, then there's still going to be some attraction in like the tiny little particles of the powder. And what they'll also do is dry the mix out a little bit, absorb some of those liquids, and make it easier to put out and less messy. And so there we go, from just a few handfuls of each of the different ingredients, and we've got ourselves a really nice bucket full of very attractive spod mix that will hopefully get them grubbing about on the bottom and feeding hard. These are the tools of the trade that I use for introducing a better bait. And to start off with, I've got a covert spod rod. It's 12 foot long and 4 3/4 pound test curve. Many of you might want to use a 13-foot rod. It might be suitable for longer range fishing, but most of mine is shorter range. And if you're not fishing at extreme ranges, I'd advise going for a shorter spod rod, purely because it's much more wieldy and lighter and a lot easier to use for extended periods. Now, I couple that spod rod with an absolute workhorse reel. It's the same model that I use for my fishing, and I would suggest don't skimp on your spod reel. It's actually going to take far more abuse than the fishing reels will take. You know, repeated casting and reeling in of spons and spods put an awful lot of strain on your reel, so make sure you get a decent one. Now that reel would be loaded with braid. I'd always go for braid over mono. Mono carries a certain amount of stretch, so depending on how hard you cast, the amount of stretch that goes into that will affect where your spawn or your spod lands. So braid will give you a lot more accuracy, and it enables you to use a thinner material, therefore increasing your distance. You do want a braid that's going to be tough and purpose designed really for this activity. It goes through an awful lot of strain and puts a lot of wear and tear on it. This is 35 pound breaking strain, but I'll still couple that with a leader. Now you'll find there are sort of pretty much two types of braid. You've got sinking braids and floating braids. Sinking braids be much thicker than a floating braid and aren't the tool that you want for introducing bait. A floating braid much thinner, so it will increase your range, but also the fact that it floats and stays on top of the water means that your retrieving is going to be a lot easier as well. As well as a tough main line, I've got an even tougher shock leader braid on here. This is a 50 pound breaking strain kinetic shock leader. A couple of reasons that I'd use that. Firstly, it's tougher and stronger and able to handle a bit more abuse, so it will absorb all the wear and tear that happens on the last few feet. Also, it being a bit thicker, it's more friendly on my finger, so it's less likely to cut in when I'm casting. If I am casting long, however, I would always recommend using a casting finger stool or a casting glove, just to make sure that you don't injure yourself, because braid, wet fingers and braid with a heavy cast can spell disaster. And lastly, the final couple of feet are lead-free leader material. The reason that's on there is because the last couple of feet really do take an awful lot of the abuse. When you're dipping your spawn or your spod into your bucket, your line just sits over the edge of the bucket, it can get caught in hinges and things like that. And I also use the same rod for clearing weed out occasionally, so it's a really nice idea to have a really tough bit, something that's bulletproof right in the last few feet. Now the two bait delivery devices that I might use are one, the same as everybody else, a spawn, or occasionally I might use a spod. The spawn will be my weapon of choice most of the time in one of the various sizes. It's quick, it's easy, and I can get a big bed of bait out with no fuss at all. However, on the odd occasion, I will still use an old-fashioned spod. I know they're a little bit out of vogue now, but they do have one advantage in that if I need a slightly more spread area of bait, they don't empty quite so quickly. So as they tilt down like that, as they're drifting across the water, they tend to spread the bait a little bit more. That's particularly applicable if I'm fishing in shallow water. So whereas the bait doesn't have quite so much time to dissipate and spread over a bigger area. Now if I'm putting out quite a lot of bait, the last thing I want to be doing is having the bucket on the floor and keep bending down to try and fill my spom up. It's not very good for my back, and it starts to ache after a bit, but also it takes my focus off the lake. So, you know, I'm losing my line of sight, shifting my feet position around. So it's a nice idea to have the bucket elevated slightly so that it's really easy just to fill it up and cast it out without bending down. Now if you've made up a spod mix and put some of it out and you've kept some back to top up with later after you've had a fish, or maybe to use the next day, you do need to be careful that it doesn't start to float. A lot of the items in the spod mix are quite dry, such as pellets and the powders that I might put in, and they will suck a lot of the moisture out of the particle elements, which dries them out and can make them float. So it's always a good idea before reintroducing some, just to test a bit in the edge and make sure some of them aren't floating. And if they are, I can top it up with a little bit of water or even some more of my liquid attractants. Well, this is the rig that I'm using today. It's a very simple rig, still got sound mechanics, but there's no bells and whistles to it. But what it does do is lay flat to the lake bed and doesn't loop up at all. Now there are various things you can do to make sure that the last few inches do stay flush to the lake bed. One of those, and the one that I use for the most part, is to use a hook link that's got a heavy element in the coating. So basically that's a tungsten coated hook link. There are bits of tungsten within the weave and within the coating that hold the hook link flat to the bottom, so it goes down and stays down. Another way to ensure that your hook link stays flush to the lake bed is to introduce some weight onto it. Now you can use a little bit of lead core in there, maybe a little piece of putty, or as I would prefer to do is to use a tungsten sinker, which can be slid straight over the top of the hook link to introduce some weight that will hold the hook link down and prevent air bubbles from making it loop up. We filmed this rig on a previous episode, so if you want to see how it's tied, have a look at the stalking video where there's a step-by-step guide. One of the big benefits of fishing over a spod mix containing lots of different food items is that it gives me plenty of options hook bait wise. Typically I've got chopped boilies in there, sweet corn, I might be using tiger nuts, stuff like that, so that gives me some really good change options, so I can fish different baits on each rod, find out which one's working and change all the rods to that bait, or if nothing's working I can ring the changes until I find something that is to the fisher's liking. Tiger nuts, I always keep a pot of tiger nuts that are in like a hook bait glug. I think it's just a sweet glug on the tigers, and they just last indefinitely in that. If I'm using sweet corn in the mix, it's a really attractive bait that carp loves to eat, and it's got a visual element to it. However, sweet corn on the hook might not be such a good idea because it's very susceptible to being chewed by small fish. So in the case of that, I will use either maize hook baits or a plastic hook bait, or a combination of the two, both of which will withstand their attentions. And as far as imitating a pellet or chopped boilies or whatever, I'll use either a quad, which are pellet shaped hook baits, they're boilie hook baits but pellet shaped, or I might chop down a wafter, use a very small wafter, maybe cut a couple of edges off it to make it look a bit more chop like. And of course I can use a whole boilie because I have got some whole boilies in the mix as well. The afternoon's wearing on now, it's getting a bit cold and I still haven't had a bite, so it's probably an appropriate time to talk about the sort of situations in which I might adopt a bits and pieces approach. Now I'd say primarily it's an approach for when fish are more active, so not so much springtime but certainly summer and into the autumn. I might be more tempted to use a more boilie based approach in the autumn when they're looking for a little bit more protein, but certainly through the summer, early autumn, bits and pieces approach is a very good way to go. You will often find there's some waters where it's the main method, certainly throughout the warmer months. Certain waters will suit the tactic and others won't. I've never found it to be quite so good on lower stock lakes, and that's for good reason. It's the sort of tactic where I'll be putting a good mass of bait out and waiting for fish to come across it and stop and feed, and to hold fish there while others come across. So it's always going to work better on lakes that have got a fairly good stock of fish. So on your low stock waters, I'd be more looking to use a much smaller baiting approach and much more concentrated, whereas for heavier stocked waters I'd be very happy to use a bits and pieces approach. I'm looking for lots of fish to be feeding at any one time and hoping to capitalise with chance for multiple capture. For that reason, it's not the sort of thing I'd be doing if I'm trying to nick a bite on a busy lake in a corner. If I'm in like a corner swim tucked away, can't really get on the fish, I wouldn't be using a bits and pieces approach, or certainly not in the same way that we have here, as in putting lots of bait out. I might use the same sort of bait, but I'd be using it in much smaller amounts. There's not really one for corners and edges, but certainly one for open water spots. It can help you to really concentrate the numbers of fish in an area, giving you a good chance of catching them. Downsides of that are that you've got many items of food, so if you have only got a small number of fish feeding, it can be tricky for them to actually come across your hook bait. You are looking to employ the method on either swims where there are likely to be quite a few fish present, or at some stage a lot of fish will be passing through, or lakes that have got large numbers of fish in them. Actually ideally suited to where we are today at 𝗶𝗺𝗵𝗿 Lake. There's a good stock of fish in here, but I can't help thinking, having not had a bite so far, that I might have been better off doing it earlier on in the year. This is the final part of our day fishing series, where we go to one particular venue and try and catch a carp in a day using a different method each time. Up until now we've been really successful and I've managed to catch on every trip. However, it's not looking so likely this time. The day's coming to an end and I'm about to wrap up and I haven't caught anything. Hopefully there's some stuff in the video that you can use and apply in your own angling, and likewise with the others in the series that we've done where we've covered various different methods to catch carp. Do check them out on the 𝗃𝗶𝗵𝗿 YouTube channel, and you might be able to find stuff that you can apply to your own angling.